Good morning, and welcome to Tuesdays with the Pilgrim, as we continue reading The Bishop Who Ate His Boots, Chapter 9. One of Bishop Stringer's major concerns was for the Christian growth and education of the children of his diocese. There were white children whose homes were in Dawson City and Whitehorse, and Indian children who traveled with their nomadic parents. In addition, many of the pioneer prospectors, trappers, and traders had married native wives who had no formal schooling, and now there were families growing up in isolated areas. The bishop felt that both the Indian children and those of mixed parentage should have opportunities for schooling. Before leaving 40 Mile, Bishop Pompous had carried on an Indian school, and in the spring of 1903 he removed the institution to Carcross, where he established it in a small house. In the following year it was transferred to a larger building, which had previously been occupied by the police detachment. After the death of Pompous, the school continued under the direction of Mrs. M. Ellis. In 1905, at the first meeting of the Selkirk Diocesan Board of the W.A., resolutions were passed suggesting the establishment of a fund for Boys' Industrial School at Carcross, and asking Bishop Pompous to obtain a suitable site. There is no report of the discussion leading up to the resolution, and no record of any action taken by Bishop Pompous. In all probability, he deliberately left the matter to his successor. In 1911, E. Dyford Evans, who was reported to have had a considerable experience in such work, was appointed as principal of the school, and a new building was erected, to which the Department of Indian Affairs contributed $30,000. There were usually between 30 and 40 boys and girls in residence, and the staff included the principal, a housekeeper, boys and girls matrons, a teacher, and sometimes a farmer or business manager. Such schools have undoubtedly made a significant contribution to the development of the Indian peoples, but at the same time they have been handicapped by lack of resources, both human and material. Staff members were invariably underpaid and, not infrequently, inadequately qualified. Emotional instability, intensified by physical isolation, made for tension and friction among some of the workers, so that the schools were not always marked by the happy and creative atmosphere which should have prevailed. Educational assumptions themselves were rarely examined, and were not always in the best interests of the pupils. By all too many workers, the Indians were regarded as inferior citizens whose greatest privilege would be to be transformed into dusky imitations of their white superiors. In spite of these difficulties, the school continued as a tangible expression of Christian witness and concern. During the years, a stream of young people passed through it to return to their own communities, fortified with a degree of useful knowledge and Christian conviction. One of the interesting services performed at the school for the larger community was the production of a diocesan journal. Quite early in the life of the diocese, it was felt that there should be a publication to serve as a medium of news and information for interested friends beyond the diocese, as well as for clergy, workers, and church people within it. The first issue of Northern Lights made its appearance in January 1913, a small 4-page pamphlet produced by the school. The editorial work was done by the principal, and the typesetting and printing by 2 of the boys. It contained both school news and notes of diocesan interest. The newspaper continued as a school venture until 1924, when it became exclusively a diocesan publication, although it still contained reports of school activities. The Carcross Indian School accepted only Indian boys and girls as pupils, but the bishop was also concerned about the children of mixed parentage living in remote areas, and had hoped that a home might be established for them nearby, where the facilities of the school could be available. A federal Department of Indian Affairs refused to countenance such a proposal, and the plan was abandoned. The bishop's next thought was to establish a small school and hostel at Selkirk, and he mentioned this more than once in his correspondence with Miss Catherine Martin, the missionary teacher at that point. Through lack of funds, no action was taken. In 1920, the opportunity came to establish a hostel which could be open to all children without restriction. Funds were made available from the Anglican Forward Movement, and a house in Dawson City, formerly the residence of Dr. N.E. Cuthbertson, was purchased. Miss E.J. Naftel, a deaconess who had been on staff of the Carcross School, was appointed as superintendent of the new hostel. This institution, to be known as St. Paul's Hostel, was formally opened by the bishop on September 21, 1920. The children and residents were entered as pupils of the Dawson Public School, and in addition to their ordinary schooling received instruction in housewifery, gardening, carpentry, and other practical skills. In the following year there were 20 children enrolled. The parents were expected to contribute towards the cost, and the hostel also received a grant for each child from the territorial government. With the increase in enrollment, an addition was built onto the house, and Mr. and Mrs. Fred Hickling were added to the staff. Bishop Stringer continued to take a keen interest in the work of the hostel, and whenever he was at home in Dawson, he was a frequent and welcome visitor. In 1923, both Miss Snaffle and the Hicklings left the hostel service, and Mr. and Mrs. C. F. Johnson began what was to become a long connection with it, broken only by Johnson's death. Charles F. Johnson, a native of Sweden, had been brought to the United States as a child. As a young man, he had set out for the Klondike, but was persuaded by Bishop Reeve to remain as an engineer at the Hay River Mission. In 1909, he was Stringer's companion on the near-fatal journey across the mountains. He and his family joined the staff of the Carcross School in 1913, where Mrs. Johnson died 6 years later. Johnson married Miss May McClellan, the housekeeper at the school, in January of 1921. Also in 1923, as the Johnsons arrived in Dawson, the buildings which had formerly been used to house the Good Samaritan Hospital were purchased and remodeled to accommodate the hostel. At the same time, the building which had been in use was offered to St. Paul's Church in exchange for $1,000 in the old rectory. The hostel continued through the remainder of Stringer's episcopate, and when he left the diocese in 1931, there were 32 pupils in residence. The one other such institution was the Eskimo Residential School at Shingle Point on the borders of the diocese. A petition asking for a school on the Arctic coast had been addressed to the bishop by the Eskimos in the 1920s. This was opened in 1929 under the auspices of the Arctic Mission Committee, with Reverend H. S. Shepherd as principal. The existing mission buildings were used for the first year, but these could afford only limited accommodation. In 1930, the buildings formerly occupied by the Hudson's Bay Company were taken over, and the school's capacity enlarged to 30 or 40 pupils. Bishop Stringer was also unhappily aware of the failure of the government authorities to make provision for the education of Indian children in public day schools. Speaking to the Diocesan Synod in 1911, he said, quote, "In the Yukon Territory, education is left largely to voluntary efforts. The government is assisting in the matter of the boarding school, for which we are grateful. Our workers have recently been conducting day schools for Indians at Moosehide, 40 Mile, Selkirk, Whitehorse, Teslin Lake, and Champagne Landing. For this work we have not been able to procure from the government sufficient aid to pay for the lighting and heating, but we feel that the work is important enough to continue, even with inadequate resources." Unquote. At the same time, he said the United States government, aware of the importance of education, had spent something like $2 million during the past 10 years for the erection of schools and the maintenance of teachers and other items that go to make an efficient school system. Although the bishop was primarily concerned with educating the native peoples and those of mixed parentage, both he and the diocesan synod felt some responsibility towards the public school system in which the white children were being educated. This responsibility found expression in the request for the inclusion of religious instruction and religious exercises in the curriculum. At the Synod of 1920, the Reverend W. W. Williams, rector of Dawson, reported that he and the Reverend J. Y. McGuckin, the Presbyterian minister, had conferred informally with the principal of the public school regarding the possibility of introducing Bible reading in the school. There is no indication of the result of that consultation. The bishop himself referred to the subject at the next synod in 1923. In his charge, he urged the teaching of the Bible in the schools, but, quote, without the introduction of any sectarian doctrines, unquote. This produced some discussion during which it became apparent that the members of the synod neither knew anything of the existing regulations and situation, nor were they agreed on what changes they would like to see. After the synod, the bishop evidently conferred with the commissioner of the territory and the superintendent of schools, and discovered that regulations similar to those in force in several of the provinces had been enacted several years before. The matter was raised once more in 1928 by two of the clergy who had not been present at the previous synod. The bishop reported on what he had discovered from the commissioner, but this evidently did not satisfy the young men. They presented a resolution for the synod, naming a committee, quote, to obtain definite information as to what are the regulations governing religious exercises or religious instruction in the public schools of the territory, unquote. The resolution was passed, and the members of the committee began their inquiry. Later in the synod, they reported on their findings. Quote, your committee find that religious instruction in the public schools of the territory is governed by the following from the Yukon Consolidated Ordinances of 1914, Chapter 79, the School Ordinance, Section 78, Religious Instruction. Quote, no religious instruction except as hereinafter provided shall be permitted in the school of any district from the opening of such school until 1/2 hour previous to its closing in the afternoon, after which time any such instruction permitted or desired by the board may be given. 2. It shall, however, be permissible for the board of any district to direct that the school shall be opened by the recitation of the Lord's Prayer, unquote. The bishop, being a humble and charitable man, refrained from comment. In his final charge to the Synod of 1931, the bishop referred to the growth and development of the Church's educational work and the influence through the years, but pointed to the opportunities for still further extension and the need for even greater resources. And that's the end of Chapter 9. We'll continue next week with Chapter 10. Until then, take care, stay safe, and God bless.